Hello, Rob McNeilly here, and just a few words about me before we start to get into this conversation about how we can do something useful to help someone heal after trauma. I had a medical background originally. I was in family medical practice in Melbourne, Australia for 10 years, then became interested in hypnosis and was so fortunate to have the opportunity of spending some time with the late Milton H. Erickson in the latter years of his life. And one of the things I learned from him that applies to all of my work and in the teaching that I've done around the globe, people also tell me that it's helpful for their work, is to remember that people are different. People are unique. And we can't really have a standard way of treating any condition because a standard approach would be useful for a standard person. And in the 40 odd years that I've been working with people in this way, I haven't found a standard person yet. So rather than trying to find out how can we treat trauma, how can we treat PTSD, how can we find a way of dealing with a condition, instead of that, if we can have the question within each individual person, what is it that's happening for them? What's their particular experience? In what way is the trauma still happening, still troubling? And then we can explore what's missing for them and then help to find it. Usually when someone comes to some help with their suffering about trauma, the trauma is well and truly stopped. But the trauma is in the past. But there's something still active in relation to the trauma that creates the suffering. So in that sense, it's not the trauma now that's the problem, but it's the way that this particular person is responding to the memory, to the experience of that trauma. So that's when we start to look in that area, we have a chance of really honing down our focus and getting to something that's going to be helpful so that someone can get to a place where they're not just managing their trauma, they're not just having it treated, but so they can actually heal and really be whole, really be over it totally. Of course, that's not always going to be the case, but very often can be. And this is much more likely to happen when we find out who this particular person is, how the trauma that they had is still affecting them, and then find out what's missing so we can help to connect them with that experience so that then they can be okay. The first thing that I've noticed about people who come with trauma, and this is perhaps a general comment, is that there's often a conflict. People will say, it's in the past, just get over it. Just pull up your socks and, get on with it. Think positive and so on. It's over, forget about it. But when someone has been suffering for some time, there can be some conflict within that person when they realise they are still suffering. Maybe they shouldn't be. So it can be so helpful to really validate their suffering, to really acknowledge just how much this has hurt them, to be sincerely appreciative and respectful of their degree of suffering. And it can make a huge difference when a client hears that we really acknowledge that their suffering is real, it's substantial, it's been really awful. So that then, once we've validated that, if that's necessary, and often it is. I just mention this in case. But once we have validated the legitimacy of their suffering, that can help to dissipate any conflict about it, any guilt about it, any bad feelings about it, so then they can start to feel solid in themselves and legitimate in their suffering. So then we can start to move on with them and find out how best we can help. And I've noticed that some people, when we say, how is this, the trauma that happened, how is that still troubling you? There's a whole litany of responses that they're not consistent. And so that's why it doesn't make sense to have an approach. When we say, what is still active for you? Some people will say, I get flashbacks. Some people will say, I've got some kind of vague blankness and I feel so uncomfortable about it. Some people say, I can't sleep, I can't go to work, I'm frightened, I can't do this, I can't go out like I used to. There's some kind of limitation in their activity. And very often there is either a sense of being on the brink of an overwhelming emotion, or sometimes there is a kind of a numbness, like complete lack of emotions. So there's such a huge variation in how people respond. And because of that, it makes so much sense if we can find a way of adapting our approach to meet these specific requirements and individual differences that people have. So, for example, if someone is haunted by flashbacks, sometimes they'll even say, I wish I could just forget it. I wish I could just get it out of my head. So then what's likely to be missing for someone in this situation is finding some way of helping them to forget, to let it be in the past, to leave it back where it was, and so on. I remember a woman telling me that she had a problem with flying, and this had happened because of a bad flight some years before. And the flight was between London and Paris. And so we did some hypnosis, and what she found helpful was the idea of acknowledging the fear that she had in that flight, where she was frightened it was going to crash, frightened she was going to die, that it was legitimate, but it was on that plane, it was on that flight, and the idea of her being able to send that fear, real as it was, send it back to London, send it back to that aeroplane, send it back to that time, that place, that experience, and that resolved it. Sometimes people, instead of being haunted by the images and flashbacks, there's a kind of a blankness, there's like something happened and I'm kind of vague and I can't remember. If that happens, this is one of the rare occasions where it can be helpful to actually help someone to go back to the event, and maybe with a little bit of emotional distance to just see what may have happened, to fill in the blanks. This is, for me, the only time when it's helpful to go back to the actual event. Sometimes it can be helpful to go back to before the event. For example, when an adult comes with a problem because of childhood sexual abuse, the abuse has nearly always, very, very rarely, is it not, stopped. So that the abuse is stopped, but there's something still hanging around. So it can be helpful to have someone go back, not to the abuse, but to before the abuse. And I'm not recommending this. I'm just going through a list of options so that we can explore and have the possibility of doing this or that or the other. So we can go back to before the trauma, before the abuse. And we can even ask the person to go back as an adult to be with the child and say, something terrible is going to happen and I can't stop it. But I can be there with you and support you, and I can tell you, because I know you are going to get through it. You're going to come out the other end. It's going to be okay. If someone has a problem in their behaviour, if they can't sleep, instead of thinking, if we resolve the trauma, then they'll be able to sleep. Maybe if we can help them to sleep, that will help them to resolve the trauma. So there are other ways that we've explored previously, or you can explore independently to help someone to go to sleep. If someone has trouble going to work, what is it about that? Are they embarrassed? Have they been away so long and they don't want to talk about it? Are they frightened that something terrible is going to happen? If we start with, I don't know what's happening here, and then we begin to explore with each individual person, then we find out, they find out what is missing, and then we can go looking for it. Very often, when something has happened in the past that is still very active in the present, very often someone starts to think about it, and there's a feeling of a tsunami of emotions that is going to wash over them. There's a feeling that if they just get anywhere near the memory of it, there'll be a flood and they'll drown in it. So naturally, we're going to try and avoid it. And of course, anything we say, oh, I don't think of a blue elephant, I'm going to avoid this, I'm not going to eat chocolate. As soon as we do something like that, it becomes a kind of like an obsession. So if there is an emotion that's very strong and overwhelming, then we can help someone to look at a situation in a rather detached, dispassionate way. So then they can start at the beginning, go through it, and then come out the other end of it. I remember a woman telling me that she had been driving to work one day, and the roads were wet, and she drove around a corner, around a bend in the road, and the car skidded and it turned over 3 times, landed the right way up. She got out and she was okay. But it all happened so quickly that it was like, and she was scared by it. She had been unable to drive. She'd been unable to go back to work for several months. So what we found was helpful for her was to ask her to imagine that she was standing on the side of the road, near that bend in the road, and to watch herself in the car approaching in slow motion. So she could watch it and be a detached, dispassionate observer, and she was able to describe to me, well, here comes the car, coming to the bend in the road, starting to skid, it's turning over, second time, third time, it's landed the right way up. And there I am, I'm opening the door, and I'm getting out, and I'm alive. And for the first time since that accident, she had the experience of being alive. That had been missing for her. Anytime there was a hint of it, possibility of driving, the possibility of going to work, it was like, whoa, a spinning was just there waiting to happen. So because she was able to be somewhat disconnected and it was slowed down so that she wasn't overwhelmed, that was what was missing for her. She was okay, she was able to drive, she was able to go back to work. So I mentioned a whole range of possible ways that we can explore. And my invitation is, when someone brings a problem with a past trauma to you, instead of treating the trauma, start by having a conversation with them about, as respectfully as possible, helping to find out in what way this problem is still active for them. I found it helpful to say, now, I can imagine if something like that happened, how it might affect you, but I actually can't know what your experience is. So could you help me so that I'll be better able to help you by letting me know just what is it about that experience that is still troubling you. And I found that asking something like that can be very well received, a lot of relief, even some clarity in responding to that question. The client starts to get clear, and that in itself can be a good start to the process of healing. Okay, so there's a lot more that could be said about this, but I hope that by exploring these together, you can start to be curious about what additional you might be able to do, perhaps be affirmed that you're already doing this. It's nice to know that, because all we're wanting to do is to increase our options. The more options we have, the more useful we'll be to our clients, the sooner everything will be back on the road, back on the job. So, thank you for watching. Please have some thoughts about what's happening. Give it a try in your clinical practice. And I look forward to hearing from you about what you've been able to do in relation to this. How you've been able to do something additional, something different to this. Thank you.